Good day to everyone. A very warm welcome to this webinar on the topic of cooperation and collaboration in the workplace. And the question being, is this pie in the sky, or is it in fact the only way forward for South African labor relations? My name is Vanessa Botha. I'm the training manager for conflict dynamics, and it is my pleasure to be hosting and facilitating today's session. So why have we chosen to tackle this topic? It's a topic which can engender healthy discussion and debate at best, but complete polarization at worst. Well, the South African economy, I think we can all agree, is wounded. And unfortunately, our labor relationships are part of the problem. The 1995 Labor Relations Act has as its purpose to advance economic development, social justice, labor peace, and then for our purposes of focus today, the democratization of the workplace. It also emphasizes the promotion of employee participation in decision-making in the workplace. Cooperation through joint decision-making in workplace forums was originally part of the plan, but unfortunately that plan never materialized. Almost all energies ended up being thrown at distributive collective bargaining efforts rather than wealth-creating consultative processes. So today we want to ask, is the time now ripe in South Africa for re-engaging in a conversation on workplace collaboration and joint decision-making as envisaged by the Labor Relations Act? What scope is there now for thoughtful employers and unions to have a fresh go at the original workplace forum design, to work together in workplaces to place the focus back where it belongs on matters such as skills formation, innovation, productivity, and gain sharing? Well, today we're privileged to have 4 speakers with us who each have firstly, a wealth of rich experience in the labor relations arena. And secondly, they're also very well researched and have some very practical viewpoints on this topic that we're going to be dealing with. I will, of course, be introducing each of them in due course, but just briefly, before I do that, I just want to give you a little bit of insight into the process that we'll be following for today's session. So the first part of the webinar will provide an opportunity for brief input by our 4 guests. They will each speak for approximately 10 minutes, whereafter I will probably be posing some follow-up questions to each of them. And then, of course, very importantly, there'll be an opportunity for you as participants to also ask questions of the speakers via an open question and answer session. In terms of how we will receive those questions, you're probably familiar now with webinar chat functions, so please feel free to submit your questions at any point during the webinar. This can be done via the chat button at the bottom of your screen, and I will collate the questions as they come in, and I'll put as many of them as possible to our guests in the time which is available to us. I'm sure that our guests as well, in the slots where they are not speaking, will be monitoring the chat function and any questions that are directed to them. Of course, as is normal, to prevent disruptions and background noise, all the participants will remain muted. And please just be aware that we are recording this webinar, and we will make the recording available to you after the conclusion of today. You'll receive an email from us early next week in this regard. So now, without any further ado, let me introduce you to our first speaker. And we're going to begin by hearing from Clive Thompson. Now, Clive is a director of the independent workplace consultancy CoSolve in Australia. He's based in Australia at this point in time. He's also a research associate at the Institute of Development and Labour Law at the University of Cape Town, of which, by the way, he was a founder director back in the 80s when it was known as the Labour Law Unit. Clive is a former partner at attorneys Cheadle, Thomson and Haysom in South Africa, as well as a former senior CCMA commissioner in South Africa. So, Clive, welcome. Thank you for being here. We look forward to hearing from you. I'm going to turn over to you.
Yes, thanks very much, Vanessa, and greetings to everyone tuning in here today and to my immediate panel colleagues as well. Vanessa, you asked if the time is ripe for us to do a reconsideration. The time has always been ripe, and it's been ripe for a long time. You've already started some of the threads that I want to pick up, and it starts with really a look at the South African society, the economy, and the politics. And the country is in a pretty parlous situation, and labour relations is part of that predicament, and adversarial labour relations is part of that predicament as well. The economy is unable to employ people. It is not delivering rates of productivity. It is not generating wealth. It is not distributing wealth, and it's impacting everywhere. It's not the only source of problems in the country, but it is a major signifier. That being the case, all the more reason to go back to what the design of the Labour Relations Act was and where we have fallen short and what else could be done. If we go back to the early 1990s, we were coming out of various states of emergency. In the 80s, there were a lot of tripartite initiatives. And it is very instructive that the first major piece of legislation produced by the new democratic government was, in fact, the Labour Relations Act. And the drafters of that statute were gifted a very special opportunity with a very special legitimacy and with a very strong team coming out of the international labour law and labour relations community. And what they looked at was, what is the rest? Legal transplants are very difficult. Institutional transplants are very difficult. But for all of that, where there was going to be some continuity, but it was also the right occasion for reinvention and for borrowing. And the consensus was that it was the social democratic model which would probably provide best for the post-apartheid South Africa. And so our internal debate was hugely influenced by the models that we'd seen being developed in the Nordic countries, in Northern Europe, Germany, the Netherlands, Benelux countries more generally. And the scheme there, which had been picked up also by writers across the Anglo-Saxon world, is that we needed to introduce into South Africa or grow in South Africa a dual channel system. There need to be a very strong and even central place for the institution of collective bargaining, backed by a constitutional right to strike, and indeed some equivalence in the lockout weapon as well. But that needed to be complemented by a high level engagement at the places where goods and services are produced, which is the workplaces themselves. And that needed to take the form of consultation, where for the first time, employees across the board could be given the opportunity to unlock their talents, make their contributions, let their voices be heard, not only in their self-interest, but let their voices be heard by way of how can they contribute to improve productivity in the workplaces. So there was the second channel that was created and was given the name of workplace forums. And many of us at the time, there was always going to be criticism, but we're fairly confident that this would be taken up, needed to be taken up as part of a new ethos running right across the society. We also knew at the time that collective bargaining was going to be the mainstay, that had been the route in terms of which workplaces really had been emancipated, and that there had to be a right to strike as well. But for all of that, there was a fairly strong sense that unions would trigger these institutions, employees would get engaged, and then we could go into a virtuous circle, that there would be integrative consultations taking place, generating higher levels of creativity in the workplace, assisting with the introduction of new technology, And that in turn would lead to gain sharing in the distributive cycle, in the collective bargaining that would come later, almost a time lapse between creating the wealth and distributing the wealth. So it didn't come to pass. And so there's still been a much stronger concentration on we simply need to distribute the wealth and we don't need to grow it. And with the way we do it is through adversarial bargaining and demands. And we've seen it most recently in the metal workers strike, which has just come to a conclusion, or I think it's just come to a conclusion, and that's been the pattern. It hasn't delivered for us, and we are wearing the consequences. And it's always been the right time to have a hard look, go back to the 1995 statute and see if we can't do something other. I'm going to leave that burden to Mthimkulu and William a little later on, but presumably it takes the shape of either something broader through the CCMA and bargaining council institutions, or possibly, if it's all too hard, for certain more progressive employers and trade unions to say, here's a model case, here's something we can turn into a demonstration site to show that the social democratic model can work. And I want to leave you just with this last thought before I hand over to my Australian colleague, Anna Booth. And that is that actually South Africans have it lucky. If you want to grow a collaborative model and you're in the rest of the Anglo-Saxon world, I'm talking about Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, another country where I'm doing some work, Sri Lanka, there is no statutory and legislative support for the second channel of industrial relations, unlike what we see in Northern Europe. And therefore you have to rely on private transient initiatives to try and get things going, and it's incredibly difficult to sustain. South Africans don't have that problem. There are rights to co-determination and consultation embedded in the statute, but they've scarcely been used. So Vanessa, let me pause at that stage and perhaps hand over to my colleague, or however else you may like to play it.
Thanks so much, Clive, for that input and for opening up for us. Much appreciated. Yes, let me now introduce our next speaker to you, who is very kindly joining us along with Clive from Australia, and is here to give us a flavour, I guess, some insight into this topic from an Australian perspective and what we can learn in that regard as South Africans. So Anna Booth is an accredited mediator under the Australian National Mediator Accreditation Scheme. She's also an experienced facilitator and arbitrator. She's recently returned to the independent workplace consultancy CoSolve, together with Clive, after she spent nearly 9 years as a deputy president in the Fair Work Commission, which is Australia's national workplace relations tribunal. She established the Commission's pioneering Cooperative Workplaces program and was its national practice leader. Immediately prior to joining the Commission, Anna combined her role in CoSolve with various non-executive directorships and board memberships, and this was after having completed a nearly 20-year career in the trade union movement. So Anna, thank you firstly very much for being here with us today, and we really look forward to your insight and impressions from the Australian point of view.
Well, thank you so much, Vanessa. I look forward to hearing others' perspectives and to the combination of contributions. Since I met Clive in 1999, I have been extraordinarily impressed by the South African story. And feel there's so many parallels, both positive as well as challenging. But I've been asked just to give a bit of perspective on how it could be that the industrial relations architecture, the institutional forums in an economy and a society could foster cooperative and collaborative workplaces. But a little bit of history first. We are, I suppose, both personally as well as nationally, prisoners in some ways of our history. The actual ability to unshackle ourselves from our history is probably what is needed for us to make progress, and sometimes that can be difficult. Australia, as you know, a colony that for many of us we would say was a country invaded by another, and a penal colony at the beginning of its settlement by the colonialists, by the Anglo colonialists. Adversarialism was almost, in the DNA of the settlement by the colonialists of Australia. And as we move forward towards the late 1800s, when the economy begins to take shape around the agricultural sector, the first interactions and violent interactions at that between the settlers on land and those who were their casual wage labourers, particularly shearers, takes place, and that gives rise to, amongst other things, and importantly to our constitution and our federation, but for the purposes of this conversation, to the first act of Parliament that set up the institutional architecture for Australia industrial relations. I race forward a couple of hundred years to the 1980s, and we see that Australia did have a flirtation with industrial democracy and an interest in the Scandinavian model. And then again in the 1980s, combining that with the social dialogue and the notion of social partners when we established what we called the Accord in Australia. But there was a resumption of hostilities very quickly thereafter in the middle of the 1990s when a Conservative government was elected, and probably most emblematic, even potentially an industrial dispute that travelled across the Indian Ocean to South Africa, at least in notoriety, the 1998 waterfront dispute, where the embodiment of the conflict, the combative conflict between labour and capital, was played out on the wharves of Australia's waterfront. And so we really have, in terms of our industrial relations history, been a country that's found it difficult to emerge from that combative, adversarial conflict of the classes. And that brings us forward to the early 2000s, when a little island of sanity and possibility was inserted into what was by then the Fair Work Act, and the institution that I have recently departed, by the way, not voluntarily. I had to be dragged kicking and screaming out of it because I loved it so much, notwithstanding my joy at being reunited with Clive. But I reached the age of statutory extinction, the age of 65 in November of 2020, and therefore was no longer able to be a Fair Work Commission member. But while I was there, and in the early stages, in fact from 2012, and then some legislative change, which is what I describe as the island of sanity and possibility, occurred in 2013, where the then Labor government amended the Fair Work Act in a tiny little way. This from 800 sections and a very big, thick act. This one section 5762AA, with 2 lines, giving the Fair Work Commission the function of promoting cooperative and productive workplace relations and preventing disputes. And the Justice Ross, the president of the Fair Work Commission, welcomed this piece of this small amendment to the legislation, and asked me and a number of other of my colleagues to form a strategy to allow the institution to build some machinery and some processes and some interventions that could be taken out into the workplaces of Australia that would achieve this function of promoting cooperative and productive workplaces. And there's a lot, of course, I could say about that, and on any other occasion, and indeed with any other individual who would like to hear me on it, I'd be delighted to spend some time talking to you all about the machinery, the application process, all of the internal capability building that was required for members in the interest-based process, which was at the heart of our cooperative workplaces program, which we began by calling the Cooperative and Productive Workplaces program, and then we shortened it. Some of us started to call it a new approach, doing something differently, a new approach. And if you know anything about Australians, you'll know everything gets shortened. So we have COSIs, and we call crib huts, and we have all sorts of names for things that we make up. And so new approaches became the title, but we've named it the Cooperative Workplaces Program now to describe exactly what it was and what it remains. So it continues, of course, notwithstanding that I've departed the Commission. And Clive asked me, and Vanessa will show her face, I think, in a minute if I speak for too long. But Clive asked me just to say a little bit about some of the examples and how they came to be, and pertinent, I think, to your consideration of how to light the flame and see it really burn bright. In South Africa of cooperative workplaces. In our case, it was a case-by-case approach. That's the nature of the institution. It accepts applications. So it was, as we described it, not a revolution, but an evolution. It was important for its acceptability in the Australian environment, for it to grow on demand, for it to be a needs-based approach. And so, FWC, or Fair Work Commission, FWC, the counterpart of CCMA in South Africa, offered this opportunity to employers, to unions, and to employees to be supported in transforming the model of their relationship in different contexts. So, for example, in an organisation called Sydney Water, which is a public water utility that has a very large footprint in the state of New South Wales, the organisation combined with its key union, and after quite a lot, I must say, of venting and of, if I might be so bold as to use the term that I know is very dear to your hearts, reconciliation. There were projects all over the workplace in very many different business units to improve efficiency. And these were measurable efficiency gains required by the regulator of the prices that this utility charges. Interestingly, a regulator called IPART, the Independent Pricing Tribunal that Clive's wife works for in Australia. And those measurable efficiency gains came from these groups within the workplace working together, creating purpose-specific groups and forums to really change the way in which work was done to improve the efficiency of the organisation. Another rather surprising case study is that of a stevedoring company called Lynx, where a union that you may be aware of from South Africa, and you may have a similar level of strength and militancy associated with the waterfront. And you heard me mention before the emblematic industrial dispute on the waterfront in 1998, and the MUA, the Maritime Union of Australia, joined with an employer called Lynx. Back then, the employer was called Port Bulk Services and was in fact a division of the very company that had been in this bitter dispute, which had huge ramifications in Australia at the time. But they had recognised that they had just been at odds, more than at war, perhaps, the war having somewhat ended towards the end of the 1990s, but they had been at odds and simply wasting their members and their shareholders' money by fighting in court, not just in the Fair Work Commission, but in the Federal Court of Australia. Literally millions of dollars were being spent on small legal points, and they had you might call it a come to Jesus moment in the Fair Work Commission when they were introduced to the concept of interest-based bargaining, and they decided to take it up. And an incredibly valuable outcome result of that engagement was the development of a method for adjusting to the cycles, the peaks and troughs. Literally, they called it a clause in an enterprise agreement that dealt with peaks and troughs. And that particular clause, because the MUA is an industry union, became a feature of all of the other stevedoring organisations in Australia. So it spread in the way of industries picking up, I suppose you'd call it benchmarking ideas from others, and that was developed through a process of interest-based bargaining, where the union and management put aside their surface differences and actually began to look at what did they have in common, what were the things that they needed to do, employers needing to be responsive and flexible to the vessel owners, the seafarers, and the workers needing to have predictable and stable incomes, if not hours, but incomes in order to have stable lives. So that particular cooperative workplaces file, as we call them, remains to this day. And another is one that is very close to my heart, being a mother of a child, or a grown-up child now, with an intellectual disability, an organisation that had to literally turn its business model upside down with the development in Australia of a new approach to funding the support for people with disability, whereby in the past organisations were funded directly by government and developed programs. The funding was turned over to the individual people with disability through what's called the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and they became purchasers of services, and the providers became providers of services rather than designers of programs which were one size fits all. And this organisation had to turn itself upside down almost overnight, and it joined with its union, the Australian Services Union, the union in New South Wales for the workers who support people with disability, and they co-designed the new services and the hours of work and the other working arrangements that would go with that, but not through a process of standard collective bargaining or enterprise bargaining, because they didn't in fact embody those outcomes in a bargain. They embodied them in memorandums of understanding that the relationship allowed them to have faith in, to have trust in, and that to this day also remains. And so those kinds of results, of course, they have substantive outcomes, but the substantive outcomes would be short-lived if they were just that. They laid down, like sedimentary rocks, in layers of mountains, the trust, I suppose, foundations to allow them to continue to work together. And they are, I'm sort of both pleased, but I'm also kind of disappointed to say, islands of sanity in the Australian environment. And thank you for doing that. It's a terrific prompt, Vanessa. And if sustainability, is an issue, there's some things that can be built in to the processes to improve it, like cascading capability through organisations and genuinely involving people in gain sharing and setting processes and mechanisms up to deal with leadership transition. And that's all been done in Australia without any machinery. So I'm so keen to hear more about the legislative framework that you've got, Vanessa, in South Africa, because if we can do this out of the Fair Work Commission without the kind of legislative support, with just a couple of lines in the Act, then I do think with will and intention and effort, it is possible to do this. And I sincerely hope it's going to occur.
Thanks so much, Anna. And yeah, I concur with you. Surely there is a lot of hope for us to get this right based on the stories that you've just shared with us. Right, so thank you so much. And I want to now introduce our third speaker for today, who is Mthimkulu Mashiya. Mthimkulu is a wonderful friend of our organization, and we're really grateful to have him back for this webinar. He has done one other with us before, as have a number of our other speakers here today. So Mthimkulu is the General Secretary of the Transnet Bargaining Council, and this is a position which he's occupied since June 2009. He was previously a civil servant holding various positions within the Department of Justice during the 80s, and he later cut his teeth in the trade union movement. Held the position of Education Secretary of CCMA, and he served in COSATU's National Education Committee, known as NEDCOM. In 2003, he was elected as COSATU's General Secretary, then became a member of COSATU's Central Executive Committee, subsequently re-elected in 2006, and then left CCMA in 2009 to become General Secretary of Transnet Bargaining Council. Mthimkulu is, we're proud to say, a conflict dynamics accredited mediator, and also a recently CEDA UK-based organization accredited mediator, and he is definitely passionate about alternative dispute resolution. And Mthimkulu, we're very keen to hear your perspectives from your unique situation in the South African labour market. So thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Thank you for that glowing introduction. I feel a bit embarrassed. Thank you so much. I couldn't help noticing what Anna is saying about the history of violent interaction in Australia. We in South Africa have had our fair share of those kinds of confrontational forms of engagement, right through the century, actually. But I would argue that quite clearly we've also had it in our DNA to be collaborative and cooperation in our exchanges. I mean, the good example is the Constitution of South Africa, which, if you trace the constitution-making process, it was really preceded by really prolonged periods of confrontational engagements, even violent engagements at that, between proponents and opponents of the status quo. Therefore, these kinds of interactions, violent interactions, occurred in various forums and platforms between employers and the unions, in communities, business, and so on. And then towards the end of the 90s, in fact, there was already, we now gather, engagement between the imprisoned and the exiled leaders and the then apartheid government. All of this, therefore, produced a wealth of negotiation experience, which, when you think about it, should then have led us into a period where we realize that confrontational and adversarial engagement doesn't really take us far in terms of achieving our shared goals and objectives. Which is why I suppose there was therefore this need to institutionalize forms of engagement. And unsurprisingly, as Clive pointed out, one of the earliest pieces of legislation was the LRA. But if you will recall, there was even an earlier piece of legislation, the NEDLEC Act, which preceded the 1995 Labor Relations Act. There as well, the kind of collaboration and cooperation was institutionalized in NETO as a platform of social dialogue. So we have this institutionalized system of collaboration in the country. And coming closer to what we are talking about, the Labor Relations Act itself, as Vanessa said in her introduction, one of the stated purposes really is that of a democratization of the workplace. And the structure through which this was meant to be done was indeed the workplace forums in Chapter 5 of the LRA. I know many analysts have written extensively about the workplace forums through years, and I see one of such analysts is here, Felicity Stedman. She wrote, I think, back in 2004, 2005, thereabouts, but there have been many analyses written about the workplace forums. But sadly, the workplace forums never really got any traction because trade unions were very suspicious of them. And I must confess, I was one of those trade union people who was very, not so much against, but they're very suspicious of workplace forums, which is why they never took off. Maybe one of the difficulties in the Act as a compromise was that the workplace forums themselves can only be initiated through majority trade unions. It says representative trade unions, but essentially it's a majority union who can trigger the establishment of workplace forums. So, but the point I'm making here is that at least from the legislative point of view, there was an attempt to really institutionalize forms of collaboration. Unfortunately, it never took place. And as Clive had said, we really directed all our energies towards sharing the cake, as it were, instead of first trying to ensure that we expand the cake, build the economy, so that we then look at means of sharing those spoils. So whilst institutionalizing the forms of collaboration and cooperation were there in the various pieces of legislation, as I've just alluded to, perhaps the lesson here is it's not enough to just institutionalize and no action is followed up to ensure that we entrench this culture of collaboration. But then it's clearly not too late. Time has always been ripe for us to look at how we can move away from adversarial and confrontational engagement. Because clearly now, history has taught us it really hasn't got us anywhere. If anything, as Vanessa says in the previous webinar, the point I made there, referring to various reports, including the Department of Labor's Industrial Action Report, which clearly show that no one gains through this form of confrontation, which leads to industrial action, strike action, that is. If anything, the economy bleeds, the country loses, workers themselves end up losing out. So clearly there's a need for us to look at a different way of doing things. And this webinar is just but one kind of an attempt really to prod everyone, especially social partners, to rethink how we do things. The workplace forums really, as many analysts have pointed out, it was modeled along the lines of the German model of works councils, which have worked very, very, very well. In fact, the recently departed, in other words, his term of office ended, the recent ambassador to South Africa from Germany, Martin Schäfer. He, in 2019, was one of the speakers at I think it was the mining in Indaba, where he had also invited leaders of business and labor from Germany who came and shared their experiences of how collaboration works for them in Germany. The point that Martin Schäfer was making is that labor relations can indeed be a hindrance to progress if they are governed by mistrust, antagonistic relationships, and even what he called ideological warfare. But on the other hand, if there is trust, there is cooperation, there's working together, there's a spirit of we are in this together kind of relationship, it can lead to the success that is enjoyed by Germany. In fact, he made a boast that there's no country in the world where industrial workers are better off than in Germany. And then some of us were thinking how wonderful it would be if that could be how South Africa is described. So therefore, Germany is still a good example. Yes, it's very, very good to look at what other countries are doing, which is why it's so important for Anna to share the experiences of the Australian model. Because ultimately, all of us who are in this global village, therefore, it bodes well for us to interchange and interact with other colleagues in other countries to share experiences. Because ultimately, if we don't work together, we see where it has led us: stagnation, no growth in the economy, huge levels of unemployment, and highly unacceptable levels of poverty. So I know William will touch on the way forward on what really needs to be done, but it's very clear that we do need a catalyst for change in society to instill and entrench this culture of participatory democracy that was envisaged in the Labour Relations Act and other pieces of legislation. In fact, the Workplace Forum, surprisingly, has the chapter dealing with the Workplace Forum in the LRA has remained virtually unchanged since the promulgation of the LRA, the Labour Relations Act, back in November 1996. But it simply remains unused. And in my chats with the CCMA director, Cameron Murajani, he indicated that since inception, the CCMA probably set up 4, certainly not more than 6 workplace forums in the country. And it's doubtful whether any of them are still operation or in operation. There's now moves towards coming up with what they call workplace participatory structures. I think this is mentioned in the collective bargaining, in the Code of Conduct for Collective Bargaining, which William is going to touch on. So by way forward, I think there is enough available for us to sink our teeth in terms of taking the process forward and move away from this adversarialism, which really hasn't taken us anywhere. Maybe with proper engagement, I see people like the PSCBC General Secretary, Friki is here. So at least there should be a way for us out of this webinar to kind of point the way of how we need to change things. Otherwise, we either swim or sink together. I don't want to sound like a prophet of doom, but clearly, if we don't change ways, really, I'm not sure what legacy we will leave our children and grandchildren. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thanks so much, Mthimkulu. Yeah, I think my feelings as I heard the last few lines that you were giving us there, or saying to us there, is just a sense of sobering, but at the same time, very encouraging that you, as someone who's right there at the coalface of you're at the heart of South African labour relations, is saying there's a chance, there's an opportunity here for us to do better. Thank you so much. Right, so our fourth speaker for today is William Thomson. And William is a practicing attorney, a commercial and civil mediator, accredited both by Conflict Dynamics and CEDA in the UK. And he's a former director of IMSA, the Independent Mediation Service of South Africa. Currently a senior CCMA commissioner and a panelist for various public and private sector bargaining councils and accredited private dispute resolution agencies. William teaches courses on negotiation, mediation, labour dispute resolution, and so forth at a number of our South African universities, and facilitates many training courses and other processes as well for the ILO, the International Labour Organization. He's accredited as a coach through UCT, and is also a research associate in the law faculty at UCT. So welcome, William. Thank you very much for being here with us today. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, and thank you just to those earlier inputs, Clive and Anna and Mthimkulu. It's indeed a privilege to be chatting about something that really feel very passionate about. And what I'm going to do is very quickly, I'm going to use the flip chart behind me, and I'd like to just start with a brief story. Being very interested in negotiation and mediation and problem solving and consensus seeking. A few years ago, Rolf Meyer, who was one of the chief negotiators at CODESA around the Constitution, he was asked at Harvard Negotiation Project, what are the key learnings that you took from that negotiation process with President Ramaphosa, who was one of the other chief negotiators? And we often speak when it comes to negotiations and mediations and consensus seeking in problem solving, as we often talk about the 3 Ps. We talk about the people who are involved, we talk about the process itself, and we speak about the problem as well. And interestingly, if I just show quickly this picture that's up on the flip chart over here, is Rolf Meyer responded and said, he spoke about the first 2 Ps. He himself, an attorney, a person who is familiar with litigation and problem solving in that way. He didn't call it people and process, but he said 2 of the key things in the CODESA talks was the trust that he had for the negotiator on the other side of the table, and the fact that they were able to trust each other, respect each other, and engage each other by sharing information and participating in a really meaningful way. The second part that he spoke about was the process itself, and he gave some illustrations of where conflicts had arisen of a really major proportion that had almost derailed the talks entirely over there too. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn over and say that I'm going to focus on these 3 Ps just in the brief time. I'm just checking my timing there, just in terms of that. And just to say that afterwards we'll have a little bit of time for questions as well. And Clive spoke very much about the enabling legislation, certain rights that have been established in statute, case law, there might be collective agreements and other agreements that are there. Anna spoke about the cooperative workplace programs, working on a case-by-case process there. And Mthimkulu Mashiya spoke very much about the institutionalization through the Labour Relations Act, through the former NEDLAC Act as well, and the whole emphasis on collaboration. I was at an international agencies conference together with the director of the CCMA, Cameron Selamorajani, at the end of 2019 in Canada. And we had representatives from Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, the UK, the United States, and elsewhere. And one of the things that struck me was the very low unemployment rate in those particular countries, a high-ish kind of economic growth rate. And then when we spoke about the CCMA in South Africa, where up to 200,000 cases have often been referred in a particular financial year, and saying that without a shadow of doubt, the CCMA is the busiest dispute resolution organization in the whole world. And often the question comes back with the Constitution, the enabling legislation, the Labour Relations Act, which right at the beginning of the Act, I just want to turn over here now, just drawn a picture of a table there and said right at the outset, Clive's spoken about when the drafters of the Labour Relations Act, we'll come back to that briefly, but the actual purpose of the Act, and I've put 4 legs over there, and the 4 legs are economic, if I just read it here, the purpose of the Act is to advance economic development, social justice, labour peace, and the democratization of the workplace. And it goes a little bit further. There's a particular section, if I just hold it up to the camera there, which is the subsection D, which talks specifically about promoting collective bargaining. It refers to orderly collective bargaining at a sectoral level. Mthimkulu Mashiya is there with the Transnet Bargaining Council. I've seen Frikkie de Bruyn, the General Secretary of the PSCBC, is with us here this morning as well. And then the last 2 under subsection D speak specifically about employee participation, excuse me, in decision-making in the workplace, and lastly, the effective resolution of labour disputes. So we definitely have the enabling legislation, and here we have the different ones here too. I've highlighted labour peace there because one of the areas has been, if I go back to 2020, the CCMA had a 15-year think tank in Gallagher Estate, and 3 key things that came out of that think tank in 2011 was that labour relations had deteriorated in South Africa from a trust, respect, collaborative, engaging kind of process there. Secondly, that the styles of negotiators had become incredibly positional and adversarial, and I think that was 2011. We're 10 years later now, and I think we're just watching and seeing how that is, and that's definitely, if it was adversarial then, it's just as, if not more, adversarial now too. And the third item that came out of that think tank was that CCMA, you're the busiest dispute resolution organization in the world, and you're doing it very well. You're doing the conciliations, the mediations, the arbitrations. You're following your mandatory, statutory, what you're required to do. What we'd like to suggest, which came out, is the area of dispute prevention, where one could be proactive in going into having cooperation, as Anna's spoken about, in workplaces. And with that was the looking at training parties in skills, in effective negotiation skills, managing conflict in the workplace, and doing relationship building interventions, RBIs, RBOs, relationship by objectives. The CCMA refers to as building workplace relations there too, to try and encourage this collaboration. And if I go a few years after that, after the absolutely devastating massacre at Marikana, is what we find there is in 2014, there was an urgent summit called a NEDLAC summit in Ekurhuleni in 2014 by then Deputy President Ramaphosa, now President of the Republic of South Africa, to have an urgent look at the state of collective bargaining. And what I've got in my hand over here is the Code of Good Practice that was birthed in Ekurhuleni. It's actually referred to in the footnotes just to the purpose. It says the declaration signed by the NEDLAC constituencies on the 4th of November 2014 at Ekurhuleni in Gauteng province. And this Code of Good Practice sets out, it deals with collective bargaining, workplace democracy and dialogue, and also industrial action in the form of strikes and lockouts, and also picketing. And it also has inside what is called an accord. It has an annexure where parties can also engage each other in what is called a good faith declaration, where the parties come in and they adopt the principles of the Code of Good Practice to adopt a more collaborative approach to collective bargaining. And some of the key issues that come out of the Code of Good Practice, it's got some fundamental principles, speaks about promoting collective bargaining, very much there in the purpose of the Labour Relations Act, and speaks about the principles of good faith bargaining. And it goes further and elaborates around the importance of the development and support of negotiators as well in collective bargaining, and through training and capacity building. And it also speaks about the various stages, as well as the possible use of facilitators and the disclosure of information for the parties to meaningfully contribute there as well. So I just wanted to touch very briefly on the Code of Good Practice and the fact that the CCMA, the bargaining councils, and other private dispute resolution organizations, the facility is there where people are able to come in and facilitate the collective bargaining process. And then very lastly, just as I look at my time here, as I'm coming towards an end here, in fact, just a minute or so left there, is just to say, in addition to the Code of Good Practice on collective bargaining, to try and enable that facilitated discussion. And there are many examples through the CCMA, through the bargaining councils, and through the private dispute resolution organizations, where parties have come together and said, let's engage in this more collaborative process over there too. And then very lastly is what Mthimkulu touched on there, the democratization of the workplace and the whole idea of workplace forums. Clive spoke about that as well. At the ILO's centenary celebrations in 2019, there was a panel at the University of Pretoria, including people like Manfred Weiss, one of the people who brought the ideas in the drafting, Professor Judge Helton Cheadle there as well, and various other people there. And at that particular seminar, Helton Cheadle was asked the question. They said to him, if you could do anything again, what would you do? And without any pause, he said, I would have legislated workplace forums. Vanessa, I think that's exactly 1 second to go. I'm going to hand back to you.
Thanks so much, William. Thanks for that insight and for reminding us again of the all-important Code of Good Practice that is there as a resource for our use. We obviously are going to be continuing the discussion. And again, I just want to remind everyone of the opportunity to post any thoughts or comments or questions into the chat function. But before I pose a few additional questions to our speakers and pick up from your questions as well, we thought we'd just put a quick question or two out there via a poll that you can respond to on screen. Craig, I wonder if you are ready to bring that up. Wonderful, thanks so much. So we've got two questions for you today. And the first one that we invite you to record your response to is the following. The question is, are there currently any well-established structures, processes, or sets of practices which are operating within your place of work, which facilitate cooperation and collaboration between employer and union, or if you're not in a unionized environment, between employer and non-unionized employees? So take a minute, if you would mind, to just record your response, choose the option which best suits you, and let's see what our audience is saying in response to this. We got most responses in, Craig?
I see, Vanessa, you're denying all the panelists a vote here. I mean, this just disenfranchisement should be allowed.
It's extremely discriminatory. Sorry about that, Clive.
I noticed that too. I was about to cast a vote.
Now we want to hear from our participants. So not that we don't care what our panelists have to say. Clearly, that's why you're here. Panelists, would you like to briefly switch your cameras back on? And is there anyone that would like to comment on the results? We've got quite a large majority at 69%, who very, very encouragingly are saying yes, there is some form of structure or process or set of practices in place, that they work well and that they do lead to constructive labor and management engagements. And then a much smaller response saying, yes, we've got these kinds of processes, but unfortunately, they're not very successful in promoting the engagement. And only one response to say nothing of that kind in place. Would any of our panelists like to quickly comment on that at all?
I'm going to jump in first and say that with great regret, I fear that the participants are not representative of the broader spectrum in South Africa. So yeah. I would imagine that conflict dynamics is attracting a group of people who are engaged in this subject matter and are doing things. Having said that, I am very encouraged. I thought that we'd get a rather despondent set of respondents here, and it is good to know, and I think it establishes the point that Anna and indeed the two domestic contributors are saying here, that where people take it up, the thing works, and and that's good.
Yeah,
Vanessa,
absolutely.
jump in just after Clive and just say I absolutely concur with him, and it might just be that we do have a group here, to coin that cliche, of preaching to the converted, or people who really get it around workplace collaboration. Because if I look at those results, I would almost turn them the other way around in terms of my experience, working through the statutory dispute resolution organizations and the private dispute resolution organizations in terms of the uptake. Where it is actually a minority that actually has that. So I absolutely concur with Clive.
Yeah. Thanks, William. Well, I guess the challenge is amongst if we are predominantly the converted in this forum, the challenge is how do we spread that? How do we spread the good news? How do we encourage people to follow suit? Craig, do you want to put up our next question very briefly, please? Okay, so one of the issues that I think William will probably touch on a little bit more when I chat to him is the concept of an RBO. So the question here is, are you familiar with the concept of relationships by objectives, and have you ever made use of such a process? Okay, the responses coming in are encouraging around RBOs as well. We'll give it a minute just for everyone to have their chance.
Just while we're waiting, Vanessa, a former Prime Minister, Keating, in Australia, had to govern from the lower house with the Senate, which is a bit like the American Senate, not really composed on a strictly proportionate basis. And he accused the Senate, when he was giving him a hard time, of being unrepresentative swill. So I fear that, not that it's swill here, but it's perhaps a little unrepresentative. But let's go.
Yes. Right, so the results in this case are a little bit more spread. We've got 39% of our respondents who are familiar with an RBO process, a relationship building initiative, and have used it successfully. I'm pleased to see that the percentage is very low of people that have tried an RBO, but that it didn't work for them. And then, a bit of a spread between others who know about it and have tried, or haven't tried, and some who have never heard about it. So I think William will, in a moment ask you to just very briefly speak to that as one of the possibilities, I think.
Might I say something, Vanessa, about it? Clive introduced me to this structured process of engagement very early on in our work together. In probably, we used it many times in the early 2000s. And I think as a structure, it's a fantastic process if you've already got a cooperative relationship. The risk, of course, it seems to me, is if you introduce it as a instrumental means to an end, and often this means the employer has said, I need something, I need an outcome, so we'll have an RBO. They're willing to invest in it for the purpose and obtain the outcome, but don't extend the power sharing beyond the RBO, take the gain, but don't share, the result. And I think that's one of my sustainability criteria for things actually maintaining.
Yeah. Thanks, Anna. Right, I think it's time to throw some questions back or out to our panelists. I'm having a look at what's come in from our participants. There's some really, really valuable observations that have come in from a couple of our participants. Thank you very much, Gefeldine, who's making, generally speaking, if I'm capturing your points correctly, Gefeldine, that's collaborative and cooperative approach, those words themselves can have for many, many people in our country a negative connotation in terms of our political past, and basically also making the point that unfortunately adversity works for a lot of the parties within the Labour relationship. It just works. It's people make their living from it, you've gone on to say as well. So yeah, those are some sobering thoughts, but very true. Anna, thanks for your response in the chat as well. I invite people to keep an eye on the chat and see the responses that are coming through from panelists. Frikkie, thanks as well for your contribution and agreement with the sentiments that are being expressed. There's a very practical question that has come from Felicity. So I think I'd like to throw that out to the panelists if I can. Felicity's asking that, she says, I'm interested to hear how conflict dynamics can reach the unconverted. Any ideas? I wonder maybe, William, if I could throw that out to you first. I know that you are passionate about how an organization such as Conflict Dynamics and others, similar organizations, could make a difference.
Thanks, Vanessa. And maybe I can just quickly go back to this this picture that we started off with earlier too, where we said that, and Frikkie, thank you, I've seen in chat there, and also Felicity, your question there too, is that in South Africa we have the processes, we have our enabling legislation, we have our codes of good practice. We even have the opportunity for workplace forum type dialogue. So the processes are there. The big question is what's not working here? And I think that, as you've said in the chat there too, Frikkie, and to others as well, is we have an incredible trust issue. I find it very a simple sort of way of just often understanding South Africa when I compared it with some other international countries and places like that, of the very, very simple Maslow hierarchy of needs. And I think that when you're dealing over here with the inequality, the poverty, the unemployment, the extremities in South Africa, it's very different to being somewhere else where the parties have an unemployment rate of under 5% and the economic growth rate of between 5 and 6 and 7 and 8%. And you've got the South African scenario here where what we're experiencing is the collective bargaining is where representatives, organized labor, negotiating with management, both in the public sector and the private sector, the needs and the interests and the mandates are coming from the parties who literally at a survival kind of level there. And so it is, to me, fairly understandable, the positional and often the adversarial and even the aggressive side there. But if we were to pop back over here, Vanessa, just from that question that Felicity asked as well, is that through trust building type processes that we can call relationship building by objectives, relationship building initiatives, or as the CCMA calls it, building workplace relations. There have been a number of processes through the bargaining councils present in this webinar, through the CCMA and through the private dispute resolution organizations, where the parties have said they sometimes refer to it as a relationship building process or an alignment process or some kind of a strategic to bring ourselves together and have a look at what our options are here, almost a bit like a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. If we want to use the metaphor of a soccer team or a football team or a rugby team, if we want to win this game, how are we going to do that? How are we going to work together? So I really believe there's a huge opportunity through the relationship building type processes where the parties have elected to look at that. I'll just give you one quick example before we hand over. And we've had that in mining, we've had it in motor, we've had it in Parliament of the Republic of South Africa, we've had it in public sector, private sector, and almost most industry sectors. Felicity Stedman was involved in an amazing process with Mercedes-Benz South Africa and with NUMSA many years ago. And Mercedes in the Eastern Cape in South Africa is building the highest quality C-Class Mercedes-Benz in the whole world. And it's also being built in China and Germany and the United States. And we've got examples of gold mines and platinum mines and others where the parties have come together collaboratively. This particular organization in the manufacturing distribution had quite a high level of conflict. They wouldn't settle their collective bargaining. They'd often refer their disputes. they said, let's do a relationship building intervention. As a result of that, they identified a few areas where they could work on. One of them was to actually train and capacitate their shop steward union negotiators, their supervisors, manager negotiators in collective bargaining and negotiation skills. And through that, also in the training, one looked at the code of good practice. And then they moved from a relationship building process into capacity building, and then into what they asked then for was a facilitated collective bargaining process. And the results of that, and that's not just one workplace in South Africa, but if we looked at the statistics coming through, I go back to what Clive said a little bit earlier there too, is that if those statistics of how many people know about RBOs, how many people are engaged in workplace collaborative forums, I think we're speaking to a smallish group here, and a group who probably gets it very well and understands it very well, because I would invert those numbers and say, as the CCMA, as the bargaining councils, as conflict dynamics and other organizations is bringing those processes in and suggesting to the parties they maybe engage in those types of processes. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thanks so much, William. Very much appreciate your thoughts on that. I see that there's another point that's come through from Emma, which I think is very worth considering. And without reading all that you've said here, Emma, basically, if I'm understanding your question or your comment correctly, it's that there are a number of workplaces where unionization is either minimal or non-existent. And so you're saying that if in those workplaces, even if the employees would like a workplace forum, they're denied a legally enforceable right to create one, or to even conclude a legally enforceable collective agreement. I know, Mthimkulu, I wonder if I could put you on the spot and ask your thoughts on this. I know that in previous discussions you've been expressing some thoughts about how to make workplace forums more practically accessible. Do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yes, thank you very much, Vanessa. In fact, I suppose the answer is in what I mentioned earlier, that in my interactions with Cameron, the CCMA director, about the non-existence and the lack of enthusiasm for workplace forums. He indicated that in the recently promulgated code of conduct for collective bargaining that William is speaking about, they do mention there the issue of participatory structures that should be encouraged. I know it's not primary legislation, because the code of conduct is itself secondary legislation, if you like. But it seems to me a kind of window of opportunity is created precisely in recognition of the fact that the current formulation in the Labour Relations Act is very disempowering for, firstly, minority unions, and secondly, for those who are not even unionized, which, if you think about it, runs contrary to the freedom of association. Simply because you opted not to belong to a union, you should not now be denied the opportunity to participate democratically in workplace structures. So maybe a look at that section in the Code of Good Practice on collective bargaining, where it deals with encouraging participatory structures in one form or the other. Maybe that's where we can look into and start creating awareness campaigns, and then we can maybe make an intervention and slowly but surely demonstrate the benefits of collaborative engagement.
Vanessa, if I can just pick up from Mthimkulu there for a moment.
Please.
I mean, what is being lost? I mean, I understand the politics of trade union triggered workplace forums, so there aren't any other competitors. We all understand that, and that's why it was first introduced. But if you look at the loss now, particularly with declining union densities right around the world, including Australia, the loss is not merely voice. The loss is also that employees don't have the opportunity to enrich their own environments and to make them more productive and to make the workplace experience better. And that is something the nation desperately needs. Vanessa, do you mind if I sweep up some of the other questions from the sidebar, just with a few and tagging some of them on?
Absolutely.
I understand the difficulty with, or can be the difficulty with the word collaboration, which is a collaborator in particular, which is ambiguous in English. There's a pejorative side to it and then an innocuous side to it. And I just don't think we should get hung up over the language. If collaboration is not a good word, jettison it. Stay with cooperation or simply find another. And the same contributor, and indeed others, are indeed making the point that it works to have an adversarial relationship. It keeps people, it mobilizes them, it links into what William was saying, that is the most workers experience. If you're down there, that is how you're experiencing life, and you want people to go out and really battle for you because life is a battle. Understand all of that. And it works for them in a limited way, but it doesn't work for economy and it doesn't work for society, because the desperate need in South Africa is to create wealth and to go more. And it is a question now, stringing onto some of the other things and coming into Felicity's question and coming into the Mercedes-Benz example, that if the masses experience and the unions are feeding in on that, and that's where they know their leverage is, if that's the way it's being played out, we're not going to get the necessary cultural transformation. It places a huge burden on leadership with the CCMA to make, I know they're busy with it, but it needs a huge investment to say we are deliberately going to deal with the important, we have to deal with the urgent, but we're going to really invest in the important and have a longer time horizon. Otherwise, this culture is not going to be shifted. And examples like Mercedes-Benz should be shouted to the rooftops. And as Felicity and others knows, it does go back to the 1980s when they contracted out of the apartheid legislation and did something unique and separate. And they're still there doing something special 30, 40 years later. And going to Felicity's question, that stuff needs to be heavily telegraphed. And it is a question of conflict dynamics and other organizations trying to search out those leaders on both sides, on all sides, who are prepared to say, we're going to make this investment. It's not a quick investment. It's a 5 to 10 year thing. And that's what we're going to need to do.
Thanks very much, Clive. There is a question that has come in. I think it looks like, Anna, you may have typed something in response to it.
I'm giving it while Clive was talking, I was typing. People can read it, I won't repeat it. I just think this is a very interesting conversation. It's a conversation that I think that the union movement, whether it be in Australia or South Africa, needs to have amongst itself. Is it, who do we represent? Are we only interested in people who pay us? Do we only want to monetize membership? Is this just about an elite group of a dwindling proportion of workers who we will fight for and fight against anyone who isn't in our membership? Or are we class-based? Do we care about workers? Is our purpose in life to be the voice of workers, whether we have people who join or don't? And yes, all of us who have been union officials get annoyed when people don't join, but there are a million reasons why people don't join. One of the very important ones is they fear that their membership will be held against them in the workplace. So if we're to be a movement that empowers and is supportive and empowering of democratization and equality, we actually have to stand for all working people and not just those who are members. And so I am with Mthimkulu and his ambition to change. It's very, it's preposterous of me to say it because I'm not from your country, but I think legislative change ought to be at least debated, and particularly if those who have the trigger are not using it, they're denying others from using it. It doesn't seem right to me.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Anna.
Yes, Vanessa, if I can just chip in quickly there.
Yes.
from what Anna is saying, going back to the German model and the visit here in 2019 of the head of the Confederation of German Employers Association with his counterpart from the German Trade Union Confederation. If you look at their mission statement, the Confederation of German Employers Organization, it says, our goal is to do business in such a way that future generations can find enough employment and create prosperity. And then you counterpose that with the German Trade Union Confederation, where it says in their constitution, the DGB, that's their German acronym, the DGB represents the societal, economic, social, and cultural interests of workers, not just members. So it ties in with what Anna is saying. Who do unions represent? In Germany, here's a very, very large, something like 6 million membership confederation saying they accept that they represent societal and economic interests. And their employer counterparts are not only confined to short-term profit making, but the way they do business in such a way that future generations can find enough employment and create prosperity. That's where we should be going as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Mthimkulu. Another comment has just come up from Frikkie in our audience amongst our participants, and I think this is something valuable to take as, unfortunately, in our limited time, we're needing to wrap up fairly soon. Let's take this point and let me just throw it out there to our panelists and see if anyone wants to make one last comment. So Frikkie is saying that labor relations, and by implication, the relationship between parties flourishes during good economic times, and it turns for the worse during bad economic times. And that parties have to find meaning even when the economy is low. Negotiations and the relationship cannot always be linked to a monetary value only, and that we have to repurpose. I think this is an extremely valuable observation that's being made. And just with literally about 2 minutes left for engagement, would anyone like to respond? William, you had your hand up first.
Very quickly. There's a book called The Obstacle is the Way. And I think just having read Frikkie's question there too, is that it's in these times of crisis, it's in these times of challenge. The poem called We're Building, We're Sailing the Ship, that's often been used by Professor Salim Abdul Karim and others about the whole COVID experience. And I really do believe that at this stage, we have an opportunity to, in this challenging place, is realize that our very survival of South Africa in the labor market and everything that then, is affected by it, we could come together at this time. And I'd like just to add to what Mthimkulu is saying there, is maybe that as the way that workplace forums were defined right at the very beginning, maybe it's time, as Emma Fergus is saying, is to re-have that conversation, to re-look and say, let's sit down and let's talk about what would work now. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thanks so much, William. So I have noted that in the Q&A function, another question has come up around some specific challenges with the outcomes of an RBO or the implementation of the outcomes of an RBO. Sibusiso, I really apologize that we're not going to have time to pose this specifically during the webinar now, as we're needing to wrap up shortly. But we are running another webinar in around about a month's time. I will be giving you the details in a second, which is going to focus specifically on the RBO tool, so to speak, and how we can start as Labour parties making best use of the RBO process and tool. So thanks for that question. I have noted it, Sibusiso. All right, so I think what I need to do is just thank everyone who has participated. Firstly, those of you who have joined us and taken time out of your busy days today. Thank you, of course, very much to our 4 speakers and guests that have joined us. And thank you for sharing your experience and your very valuable thoughts with us. This is something that I think is just the beginning of a discussion which must continue, and we as Conflict Dynamics are wholly committed to continuing this discussion and spreading the news, spreading the word, as I think it was Felicity implied. So if you are interested in exploring this topic further within your organization, we'd be very happy to assist. Our CD Direct panel offers highly skilled facilitators who are able to facilitate any form of relationship building process, whether it be a formal RBO or anything else customized to your needs. If you think this is something that could strengthen your labor relationship, then please do feel free to contact us for a chat on how we could assist in that regard. Also, as I just mentioned, we are going to be running another webinar on the 19th of November, which will be focused specifically on relationship building interventions, RBOs. Please do keep a lookout for the advert that will go out for that event soon, and we'd love to see all of you, as well as many colleagues as well that you want to pull in and can bring with. We'd love to see you there. And then lastly, of course, we're always here to offer any form of in-house training, a tool that you feel could assist with getting this discussion going further and with implementing some form of cooperation and collaboration within your workforce. In particular, we offer specific training around the challenges of managing within a unionized environment, and we also offer a comprehensive shop steward development program consisting of a number of learning modules. So please do have a look at our website for more information about all of this, and subscribe to our website as well. We'd love to have you, because the conversation continues via that channel as well. So thank you very much for joining us today once again. Please continue to stay safe and to stay well, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you, everyone.